At the altar, two strangers said yes, carrying more resentment than hope, united only by interests they did not choose. During the honeymoon, the silence between them was more intense than any argument, until an unexpected conversation began to reveal truths that neither was prepared to face. Between pride, old hurts, and a forced coexistence, something began to change slowly and dangerously, as if destiny were rewriting an agreement that should never have existed. But when everything finally seemed to make sense, a cruel revelation threatened to destroy what had barely begun. Before discovering what really happened on the wedding night and how this unlikely marriage turned upside down, subscribe now for more stories full of emotion, twists, and unexpected secrets. The ceremony was scheduled for 5 in the afternoon, but Isabella Montero had already been regretting it since dawn. Sitting before the mirror of the room she had occupied her entire life, she looked at the reflection of a bride she did not recognize. Hair pinned to perfection, imported lace veil, lipstick in the right color for the right day. Everything impeccable, everything wrong. Outside, Fazenda Santa Cruz had woken up too early. Buffet trucks crossed the gate before 6. Florists set up arches of orchids along the avenue of ipe trees. The band that would play during dinner did 3 hours of rehearsal in the renovated warehouse. The party would cost the equivalent of what many families in the region took an entire year to earn. But money had never been a problem for the Monteros, nor for the Cavalcantes, and that was exactly what that marriage was about. Money, land, power, and the silent agreement struck between two men who never needed to say out loud what they wanted. Isaura Montero knocked twice before entering. It was her mother, with that wide smile that served any occasion, birthdays, wakes, and arranged marriages. She placed her hands on her daughter's shoulders and observed the reflection for a long moment. "You look beautiful," she said with a conviction that deliberately ignored Isabella's closed expression. "I am 30 years old, Mother. I am not a trophy." "No one said you are, but you know what is at stake. Eduardo is a family man, serious, successful. You will understand each other." "You?" Isabella did not answer. She had said everything she had to say in the last 6 months, in the arguments at the dinner table, in the calls with her father that always ended in the same heavy silence, in the nights she lay looking at the ceiling, trying to understand at what moment her life had been placed on the same balance as hectares of land and corporate shares. She was a lawyer with a postgraduate degree in business law. She had her own office in Ribeirão Preto and had built brick by brick an independence she was more proud of than any inheritance. And yet, there she was, about to marry Eduardo Cavalcante, a man to whom she had been formally introduced only 4 months ago. On the other side of the fazenda, in the renovated lodging that served as a temporary suite for the groom and his best men, Eduardo Cavalcante squeezed his collar button as if he were trying to loosen something inside his chest. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with a way of moving his jaw when he was irritated that his partners had already learned to recognize from afar. He was the operational director of Cavalcante Agro, one of the largest soybean processing companies in the Center West, and he treated every decision in life as he treated those of the company, with spreadsheets, deadlines, and a calculated margin of error. His younger brother, Felipe, was lying on the sofa with his suit jacket thrown over his face. "You can still give up, you know," Felipe murmured from under the fabric. "I can't." "You can. Just get up, take the car, and—" "Felipe." The brother took the jacket off his face and looked at Eduardo with an expression that mixed humor and genuine concern. "Do you even like her?" Eduardo was silent for a moment. He had spent enough time with Isabella to know she was intelligent, direct, and had not the slightest interest in pleasing him. In 2 formal dinners and 1 business event, she had disagreed with him at least 4 times in public without any embarrassment. It was fascinating and irritating in equal measure. "I respect her," he said finally. "How romantic," Felipe replied, putting the jacket back over his face. The ceremony took place under a copper-colored sky, the kind that the interior of São Paulo offers on September late afternoons. Isabella walked down the avenue of ipe trees beside her father, Renato Montero, who walked with the firm step of someone who had planned that moment for years. She kept her eyes forward, as she had mentally practiced during the week. She was not the type of woman who cried in public. When she reached the altar and met Eduardo's gaze, she felt exactly what she expected to feel. Nothing special, just two adults fulfilling a formality. The vows were read with the correct intonation. The priest said the usual words. Eduardo placed the ring with surgical precision, as if he were signing a contract. Isabella did the same. The kiss was brief, almost symbolic. Their lips touched for long enough to satisfy the audience, and not a second more. There was applause. There was crying among the older guests. There was champagne. Isabella raised her glass and smiled for the cameras with the skill of someone who learned early on that smiling is a form of social survival. During the party, they circulated among the groups with the performance they both knew how to execute. Eduardo was fluent in the language of business celebrations, firm handshake, precise comment, laughter at the right moment. Isabella knew her role equally well, elegant, articulate, present enough to be noticed, and discreet enough not to overshadow the narrative the families had built around that marriage. On the outside, they were the perfect couple. On the inside, they were two strangers trapped on the same stage. At the parents' table, Renato Montero and Helio Cavalcante toasted with the satisfaction of men who had closed a difficult deal. The fusion of the Montero lands in the Triangulo Minero with the Cavalcante processing capacity in Mato Grosso was a move the agribusiness market would comment on for months. The children were the most elegant legal link the lawyers of both families could find. Neither of the two newlyweds was present in that toast. Not truly. At 11 at night, when the last guests began to say goodbye, a discreet driver took the couple to the Ribeirão Preto airport. The flight to Fernando de Noronha departed at 12:20. In the VIP lounge, sitting side by side in armchairs separated by a carefully calculated distance, Eduardo opened his laptop and Isabella put on her headphones. There was no need to talk. They had agreed on this without needing to say it, with the silent efficiency of two people who understand the rules of the game without anyone needing to explain them. The plane took off under a sky full of stars that neither of them took the trouble to observe. Noronha received them with the hot and salty air that the island offers even in the early morning. The inn had been chosen by Eduardo's assistant, discreet, expensive, with a suite facing the sea that under other circumstances would be the ideal setting for a honeymoon. There were rose petals on the floor. There was a bottle of champagne on ice. There were candles lit in small holders around the bathtub. Isabella looked at all of it and felt an almost irresistible urge to laugh. Eduardo stood still at the entrance for a moment, looking at the room as if he were evaluating an asset that did not yield as expected. Then he went straight to the balcony, rested his arms on the railing, and stood looking at the dark ocean. Isabella took off her shoes, threw her veil on the bed and went to the mini-fridge. She took a bottle of water, drank half of it while standing, and then went to sit on the edge of the bed with her wedding dress still completely intact, looking at the petals scattered on the floor with an expression that mixed exhaustion and irony. "Can we be honest?" she said, without looking at him. Eduardo turned his head from the balcony. "About what?" "About the fact that neither of us wants to be here." He entered the room slowly, as if he were thinking whether or not he should accept that conversation. He stood near the balcony door, arms crossed. "We are here," he said. "That doesn't change anything." "No. But pretending we are happy about it doesn't change it either." She raised her eyes to him for the first time that night, with a frankness he didn't expect. "I don't like to lie. Not even to myself." Eduardo was silent for a long moment. Then, with an almost imperceptible movement, he uncrossed his arms. "Then let's not lie," he said. And that was, without either of them knowing yet, the first true thing they said to each other since the day they met. The early morning in Fernando de Noronha has a silence different from the mainland. It is not an absence of sound. It is the presence of the sea, wind, and the constant hiss of waves rising and falling on the rocks below. Isabella stayed awake for a long time after the conversation ended, lying on the edge of the huge bed with her eyes open to the ceiling, listening to that full silence and trying to understand what had changed. They had talked for almost 2 hours. It wasn't what she expected for a wedding night, but then nothing about that marriage had been what she expected. so why would the wedding night be different? Eduardo had pulled a chair from the balcony into the room, sat facing her with that executive posture that seemed glued to his body even outside the office. And they had spoken. Truly. Without the performance that both had sustained for months. He had told her about his father. Helio Cavalcante was a man who confused love with strategy. He hugged his children when they produced results and ignored them when they didn't. Eduardo learned early on that the only way to exist inside the house was to be useful. He became the best in school, the most efficient in college, the most disciplined in the company. Feelings were noise in the system. He had learned to turn them off with the same naturalness with one turns off a notification. Isabella had heard all that without interrupting. Then she told her side. Renato Montero was different from Helio, warmer, more demonstrative, but equally incapable of separating his daughter from the estate. For him, Isabella was the heiress before she was the person. Every professional achievement of hers was celebrated as a family asset. Every personal choice was evaluated through the prism of the impact on business. When she opened her own office in Ribeirão Preto, her father had congratulated her and then asked if she intended to serve the Monteros as a priority client. "Did you get married because he asked?" Eduardo asked at a certain point, with a directness she didn't expect. He didn't ask. He presented it as a decision made. She paused. "I could have refused." "Why didn't you refuse?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Isabella looked at her hands, still with the ring that had been placed hours ago. "Because I was tired of fighting him on all fronts at the same time. I chose the battles that mattered." She raised her eyes. "And you?" Eduardo took a while to answer. "Because I thought I could manage this like I manage everything else, with enough distance so it wouldn't hurt." There was a naked honesty in that answer that Isabella didn't expect from a man like him, and it was that, not the setting, not the champagne forgotten on ice, not the rose petals scattered on the floor, that made her look at him differently for the first time. They fell asleep each on their own side of the bed, without touch and without ceremony, but with something that wasn't there when they arrived, the awareness that the other was a real person. The next morning, Noronha woke up with a sun that asked no permission. Isabella opened her eyes before the alarm, looked to the side and saw that the bed was empty. She got up, went to the balcony, and found Eduardo already awake, sitting in a straw chair with a cup of coffee in his hand, looking at the horizon, where the sea met the sky in a line of blue upon blue. He heard her footsteps and turned his head slightly. "There is more coffee in the thermos," he said, without further preamble. She took the cup that was on the small table, filled it, and went to sit in the other chair. They were silent for a moment, both looking at the ocean. "I've never been here," she said. "I came once. For work." She turned to him with a slightly incredulous expression. "For work. In Fernando de Noronha. Meeting with an investor who insisted on doing business in places he considered inspiring." He took a sip of coffee. It didn't work. The business, not the place. Isabella laughed. It was a small laugh, almost surprised by itself, as if she didn't expect that man to be capable of saying something with grace. Eduardo noticed the laugh, and something in his face, that executive rigidity, loosened for an imperceptible instant. The following days followed their own logic, built by two adults who needed to occupy the same space without the crowds and performances that had served as a shield until then. On the first morning, they went to Baía do Sancho beach separately. She went down early, he went 2 hours later and found her coming out of the water. They exchanged a nod. The next afternoon, they rented snorkel equipment at the same spot and ended up making the trek together without either of them having proposed it out loud. On the third day, they had dinner at the same table with a conversation that lasted more than 3 hours. They talked about work, the safest ground for both. Eduardo explained the operations of Cavalcante Agro with a precision that revealed someone who had spent years understanding every gear of the business. Isabella listened with genuine attention and then asked questions he didn't expect, questions about contractual structure, about revenue concentration risks, about how the company legally protected itself in years of crop failure. Eduardo answered everything, and as she spoke, he began to realize he wasn't facing someone trying to impress him. He was facing someone who truly understood what she was asking. "Have you analyzed the contract our fathers signed?" she asked at a certain point. "I skimmed it. There are 3 clauses that could be problematic in the long term." She took a napkin and began to draw a schematic structure with the pen she carried in her purse. Here, here, and here. If the merger proceeds without adjustment, any litigation between the families creates a huge grey area. Eduardo stared at the napkin for a long moment. "You read the whole contract." "I am a corporate lawyer. Of course I read the whole contract." He was silent, and in that silence there was something different from the coldness of the first hours. There was respect, real, not performative. On the penultimate night of the trip, there was a tropical storm that closed the island for a few hours. They were trapped in the inn, and without the sea and the sun as natural escapes, they ended up in the living room of the suite with a deck of cards found in a drawer. Eduardo didn't know how to play truco. Isabella knew and spent 40 minutes teaching him with an ironic patience that he finally reciprocated with a graceful defeat. "You let me win," she said. "I didn't. I'm actually bad at it." A man who admits he's bad at something. Rare. "I'm bad at several things." He gathered the cards calmly. "I just don't usually announce it." She observed him for a moment, with that analytical expression he had already learned to recognize, the way she processed information before concluding anything. "Why did you tell me about your father last night?" she asked. "You asked to be honest. It seemed fair to correspond." "Do you always act by reciprocity?" "Almost always." He paused, but this time it wasn't just that. She didn't press, but something in that answer stayed with her after they turned off the lights, each on their own side of the large bed, listening to the rain beat against the suite window. On the day of the return, while waiting for the flight at the island's airport, Eduardo received 3 consecutive calls from his father. He didn't answer any. Isabella saw it without commenting, but when the plane took off and the island faded below as a green dot in the blue, she thought that perhaps the 2 of them had more in common than appeared on the surface. It wasn't love. She was too honest with herself to call what was between them love after 1 week, but it was something, a curiosity that hadn't been there before, a different attention. And when the plane landed in Ribeirão Preto and the car took them to the house they had chosen together on paper, but had not yet truly inhabited, Isabella looked through the window at the familiar streets of the city and thought that, for the first time since saying yes at the altar, she wasn't afraid of what would come next. The house was too big for 2. That was the first thing Isabella thought when she crossed the main door with the travel bag still in her hand. It had been chosen by Eduardo's parents, a 2-story house in a gated community in the Jardim Botanico neighborhood in Ribeirão Preto, with 5 bedrooms, a double living room, an office, and a back veranda overlooking a green area, everything decorated by a designer hired without either of them having been consulted about preferences. There was a huge abstract painting on the living room wall that Isabella immediately decided she hated, but she said nothing. Eduardo walked through the rooms in that systematic way she had already learned to recognize, evaluating, cataloging, identifying what worked and what would need to be adjusted. He stopped in the office for a longer time than in the other rooms, looked at the 2 separate desks pushed against opposite walls, and made a comment she didn't expect. "You'll want to change the position of your desk. The light comes in from the wrong side of the window for someone who is right-handed." She stood in the doorway for a moment. "How do you know I'm right-handed?" "I saw you sign the marriage contract." Isabella stared at him for a second and then simply said, "You are right about the desk." That was, without either of them making a ceremony of it, the first real collaboration inside the house. A routine settled in with the strange organicity of 2 people who need to share space without having an instruction manual. Eduardo woke up at 5:30, did an hour of exercise in the gym room in the basement, and left for Cavalcante Agro at 7:40. Isabella woke up at 6:40, had coffee alone in the kitchen with her laptop open, and left for the office at 9. They crossed paths in the hallway with the accidental punctuality of people who inhabit slightly different time zones. In the beginning, this crossing yielded a nod, A short good morning, nothing more. But then the coffees started. It was by accident in the second week. Eduardo came back to pick up a document he had forgotten and found her in the kitchen at 7:20, hair still tied back and wearing glasses, concentrated on a contract she was underlining with 3 different colored pens. There was a cup of coffee on the edge of the table, getting cold. He remade the coffee without asking, placed it in front of her, and went to get the document. She raised her eyes from the paper, looked at the cup, looked at him as he was already walking out the door, and said nothing. But the next morning at 7:20, there was a cup prepared for him too. They didn't talk about it. It simply happened. Work began to enter the conversations naturally. Isabella was in the middle of a complex case involving a dispute between heirs of a fazenda in Sertãozinho, 3 brothers, an 800-hectare property, and a will with wording she called criminally ambiguous. Eduardo listened while they had dinner, without faking interest he didn't have, and sometimes asked questions that came from an angle she hadn't considered. They weren't legal questions. They were questions from someone who understood how the logic of large rural landowners worked from the inside. "The eldest brother is bargaining for the cattle, not the land," Eduardo said one night, after she explained the impasse. "Why?" "Because land generates inventory fights for years. Cattle is a liquid asset. He wants to get out with quick money and leave the other 2 fighting over the fazenda." Isabella stood with her fork in the air for a moment. "That completely changes the mediation strategy. It's what I would do in his place." She noted that on the pad she always left near her plate during dinner, a habit Eduardo had found strange in the first week and now simply accepted as part of the landscape. The next day, she entered the mediation with the right angle, and the case began to move for the first time in weeks. He didn't talk about it, and neither did she. But when she got home that night, she went straight to the kitchen, where he was heating something in the microwave, and said, "You were right about the eldest brother." Eduardo didn't turn, but she could see by the reflection in the oven glass that he had given a small, quick smile before composing that usual expression again. On his part, Cavalcante Agro was going through a moment of expansion that brought with it a series of contractual complications that the company's internal lawyers were not managing to resolve with the necessary agility. One October afternoon, Eduardo arrived home earlier than usual with a thick folder of documents and settled in the office with an expression she immediately recognized as contained frustration. "What is it?" she asked from the door. "Contract with a carrier. The company wants to revise the penalty clauses for delays, and my legal team is taking 3 weeks to give me an opinion." "Send it to me." He raised his eyes. "You don't need to—" "Eduardo, send the file." She had the opinion ready in 48 hours, 3 pages objective, with an indication of each point of risk and a suggestion for alternative wording for each problematic clause. Eduardo read it twice, took it to the meeting the next day, and closed the contract with the carrier in a single session. When he returned, he found Isabella in the office with her laptop and simply placed on the table next to her a bottle of the wine she had once mentioned she liked. She looked at the bottle, looked at him. "Thank you," he said, "just that." "You're welcome," she replied. And in that simple exchange, there was a language that neither of them needed to translate. October advanced with that silent complicity, growing so gradually that it was impossible to say when it had begun. There was a new logic in the house. Whoever arrived first put water on to boil. Whoever left last turned off the office lights. On a rainy Saturday, they discovered they both had the habit of reading in the living room with instrumental music in the background, and they spent 3 hours like that without exchanging a word, each with their book, in a silence that was no longer hostile but simply comfortable. It was on this Saturday that Mariana, Isabella's younger sister, showed up unannounced. She was 26 years old, her hair always purposely messy, and a frankness even sharper than her sister's. She walked through the door as if the house were hers, threw her bag on the sofa, looked at the 2 of them, her with the book, him with the other, and said, "Wow, you look like a real couple." Isabella closed the book. "What do you want, Murray?" "Came to see how the situation was." Mariana went to the kitchen, opened the fridge with the ease of someone who grew up doing it, and shouted from there, "It's well stocked. Good sign." Eduardo looked at Isabella, with an expression that silently asked if that was normal. She answered with a look that said yes, it was always like that. He nodded slightly and went back to the book. Mariana returned with a juice and settled in the smaller armchair, looking at the two of them with an open curiosity that Isabella knew well. It was her sister's way when she was trying to understand something that didn't fit into the categories she already knew. "Did you read the contract Dad signed, Bela?" "I did." "And?" "And I'll take care of it at the right time." Mariana looked at Eduardo, who hadn't raised his eyes from the book. "Does he know?" "He knows," Eduardo said, without raising his eyes. Mariana was silent for a moment, and then, for the first time since she had arrived, she truly smiled. Isabella saw that smile and felt something move in her chest. It wasn't discomfort. It was the recognition that the house had begun to have a different temperature, more human, more real, and that she no longer knew for sure what to do with it. November arrived with the dry heat that the interior of São Paulo accumulates before the first rains, and with it came the first social event that Isabella and Eduardo would face together since the wedding. The annual dinner of the Triangle Producers Association was one of the most important dates on the regional agribusiness calendar. 200 guests, speeches, negotiations disguised as conversation, and the inevitable presence of both families in the same room for the first time in months. Isabella learned of the event when Eduardo placed the invitation on the kitchen table one morning without any comment. She read it, folded the card and said only, "I'll go in blue." "We don't need to match," he replied, already with his back turned. "I'm not matching. I'm informing." There was a difference, and they both knew what it was. The day of the dinner was tense in ways that neither of them verbalized. Eduardo spent the afternoon on calls and arrived home late, with that tightness in his jaw that indicated some negotiation had stalled. Isabella had left the office earlier to get ready, and was ready when he came up the stairs, but seeing him enter the room with that closed expression, she simply said, "You have 40 minutes. He looked at her. The dark blue dress, hair down, an elegant simplicity that required no explanation. And for an instant, the closed expression opened slightly. Just for an instant. "Thank you," he said, and went to the bathroom. They left on time. In the ballroom of the country club where the dinner was held every year, Isabella recognized the territory with the precision of someone who had grown up in that environment. Face A was the husband of the input supplier who vied for a contract with the Monteiros. Face B was the lawyer who had tried to recruit Isabella to his office 2 years ago. Face C was Donna Auxiliadora Brandão, 72 years old, matriarch of one of the largest coffee fazendas in the region and the most efficient source of gossip in the interior of São Paulo. It was Donna Auxiliadora who arrived first. "Isabella! What a beauty of a woman!" She squeezed both of Isabella's hands with that surprising strength of people who worked with their hands their whole lives. Then she turned her eyes to Eduardo with an evaluative expression she didn't hide. "And this is the husband. Helio Cavalcante told me a lot about you, my son. I hope not everything," Eduardo said with that tone that could be humor or caution, and Donna Auxiliadora laughed with genuine satisfaction. "I like a man who doesn't take himself seriously." She tapped his arm and turned to Isabella with a look that went from face to ring and back to face with expert speed. "You look different, daughter. Lighter." Isabella opened her mouth to give the standard answer, the kind of polite and vague answer one gives to observations like that, but Eduardo came a little closer to her at that exact moment to greet someone passing behind, and the contact of his arm with her shoulder was so natural, so unceremonious, that she completely forgot what she was going to say. "It's the marriage," she said finally. "It does one good." Donna Auxiliadora smiled with the look of someone who has seen a lot in life and recognizes the real when it appears. The parents arrived separately, as was customary. The Monteiros on one side, the Cavalcantes on the other, each family with its orbit of allies and interlocutors. Renato Monteiro found his daughter by the bar and hugged her with that genuine affection that made everything so much more complicated. Because the father wasn't a villain, he was a man who loved his daughter the wrong way, and that was harder to manage than direct malice. "Are you okay?" he asked in a low voice, his eyes passing quickly over Eduardo, who was a few meters away talking to a director of the cooperative. "I am, Dad." "Is he treating you well?" Isabella looked at her father for a moment. "Yes." And it was true, and the truth of it still surprised her sometimes. Renato nodded, seemed to want to say something more, and then opted to fill his glass with water with the efficiency of someone closing a subject. On the other side of the room, Helio Cavalcante pulled Eduardo into a conversation that lasted longer than it should have. Isabella wasn't close enough to hear, but she knew Eduardo's body language well enough now to know when he was on the defensive, the angle of his shoulder, the way he brought his hand to the side of his neck for a second before answering. There was some pressure being applied there. The dinner itself ran with the superficial elegance that those events always produced. Isabella was placed between the president of the association and the wife of a sugarcane producer who talked for 40 minutes about a renovation she was doing on a beach house without anyone asking. Eduardo was 3 seats to the right, trapped between 2 directors of a pesticide company who clearly wanted something from Cavalcante Agro. They looked at each other across the table at a certain moment during the second course, with the simultaneity of those who share the same thought without needing words. The thought was, when will this end? And there was in that silent exchange a shared humor that was, without either of them having planned it, the germ of a real intimacy. It was during dessert that the moment Isabella would not forget happened. Helio Cavalcante, who had drunk more than usual, stood up to make an impromptu toast. He thanked those present, spoke of business, and then, with that pleasure of a man accustomed to using people as narrative, said, "And I also want to celebrate the union of our families. My son Eduardo and the beautiful Isabella Montero, now Cavalcante. 2 estates that have become one. May the fruits of this partnership come." There was applause. There were smiles. There was the sound of champagne being raised in a toast. Isabella didn't move for a moment. 2 estates that have become one. She had heard variations of that phrase her whole life, but never beside someone who heard it too, who understood what lay beneath those words, who knew the specific weight of that reduction. She raised her eyes and met Eduardo's. He had heard it, and in his gaze there was something that was neither anger nor resignation. It was recognition, the same weight, carried in different ways. Eduardo raised his glass, made the toast with everyone, and then set it down with a calm that Isabella knew as the contained version of a well-managed storm. In the car back, they didn't talk about the toast. There was no need. But when they got home, and Eduardo went to the office, on which was his way of processing difficult things, Isabella went to the kitchen, made 2 teas, took one to the office door, and knocked once. "You can leave it there," he said from the other side. She left it, but she stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the silence on the other side of the door, and thought there was something deeply wrong with the fact that the person who most understood what she had felt that night was exactly the man she had been forced to marry. Wrong, or perhaps, and this thought bothered her more than the first, perhaps it was the most right thing about this whole story so far. The turning point happened on an ordinary night in November, without warning and without ceremony, as the things that really matter usually happen. Eduardo had arrived home earlier. The board meeting had ended sooner than expected, a rarity, and he entered through the side door that led straight into the kitchen and found Isabella standing by the stove, with an apron over her work clothes, stirring a pot with the concentration of someone solving a complex problem. There was music in the headphones she hadn't taken off yet, and so she didn't hear him enter. He stood still for an instant at the entrance. She didn't know she was being observed, and there was something in that, in the way she moved without performing anything for anyone, her hair slightly coming undone from the clip, the pen still behind her ear as if she had stepped out of the office and into the kitchen without a break. That was the most real version of her he had seen so far. She took off one headphone upon feeling movement behind her and turned around. "You arrived early." The board finished at 6. She nodded, went back to the pot. "I'm making risotto. There's enough for 2 if you want." "I want." They had dinner in the kitchen, not in the formal dining room they rarely used. The kitchen table was smaller, more practical, with a proximity the other didn't have. Eduardo opened the wine. Isabella served the plates, and then they began to talk about her work, about a hearing that had gone much better than she expected, about the strategy that had worked and why. He listened with that attention she had learned to recognize as genuine, not polite, because Eduardo wasn't the type to pretend to pay attention when he wasn't. At some point, the conversation left work and entered freer territory. They talked about the fazenda, where she had grown up in Uberaba, childhood spent between the smell of wet earth and the early mornings when she would stay on the veranda with her grandmother telling stories that no one else in the family knew. They talked about the years he spent outside Brazil, in Chicago, doing an MBA, and about how the city in winter had a cold that wasn't temperature. It was a physical presence, a living thing that pushed you inside any closed space and forced you to stay with the people around you. "Did you go alone?" she asked. "I did, and I stayed." He swirled the wine in the glass. "It's strange to be in a place where no one knows your surname. Liberating or scary?" "Both, but more liberating." She looked at him for a moment. "Did you come back because you wanted to, or because your father asked?" "Because it was the agreement." He raised his eyes. 2 years away, then the company. I knew the conditions when I went. And if there were no agreement? The question hung suspended. Eduardo was silent for a real amount of time, not the silence of someone avoiding, but that of someone truly thinking. "I don't know," he said. "I never allowed myself to truly think about it." She nodded, as if that answer confirmed something she already suspected. When the plates were cleared and the wine was almost at an end, there was an atmosphere between them different from everything that had existed before in that house. It wasn't tension, it wasn't professional cordiality, it wasn't the discreet solidarity of two people in the same boat. It was something warmer, more exposed. Isabella was leaning against the counter with her glass in hand when Eduardo got up to get the bottle and passed close to her in a space narrower than necessary. She didn't move. Neither did he. For a second, they were too close for the proximity to be accidental, and far enough for either of them to retreat with dignity. Neither retreated. The kiss was not the kiss of the wedding, that mechanical act before 200 guests. It was the opposite of that. It was slow, almost cautious, like two people testing a surface before placing their full weight. And then, when it became clear the surface held, it stopped being cautious. When they pulled apart, both were silent for a moment. It wasn't the silence of before, it was another kind, denser, more loaded with things that neither of them yet knew how to name. "This," said Isabella, and stopped. "I know," he said, and that was enough. The following days had a different quality. There were no declarations, no formal conversations about what had changed, but there was a lightness in the house that hadn't been there before, a new way of looking at each other, of moving in the same space, of starting a conversation that didn't need to have a professional purpose to happen. Eduardo began to arrive home earlier some nights a week. Isabella stopped taking work to the bedroom after 10. These were small adjustments, almost invisible, but together they composed something that looked for the first time like a truly shared life. Felipe came to lunch on a Sunday and kept looking at the two of them during the entire meal with the expression of someone seeing an unexpected meteorological phenomenon. "What is it?" Eduardo asked. "Nothing." Felipe took more rice with exaggerated innocence. "Just that you've laughed 3 times since we sat here. I'm counting." I laugh. "Eduardo, I'm 30 years old. I can count on the fingers of one hand the times I've seen you laugh during a meal." Isabella hid her smile behind her glass. "Does she do that to you?" Felipe asked his sister-in-law, with a genuine curiosity that had nothing malicious about it. "I don't do anything," said Isabella. "She doesn't do anything," Eduardo confirmed. "That's exactly it," said Felipe, pointing his fork at the two of them with the satisfaction of someone who just solved a puzzle. "That's exactly what is different." That afternoon, after Felipe left, Eduardo and Isabella stayed on the back veranda with the last glasses of wine from lunch. The November sun went down slowly over the green area of the community. There was a comfortable silence she no longer needed to fill. "Do you believe this is real?" she asked. She wasn't looking at him when she asked. She was looking at the garden. He took a while to answer. I'm starting to believe it. She turned her face to him. There was a vulnerability in those words that was new in him, that cost something to say, and she recognized the price because she knew the same price in herself. Me too, she said. And it was the first time either of them admitted out loud that what was between them was no longer just an arrangement that had worked out. It was something neither of them had chosen, and that paradoxically had become the truest choice of both. They didn't know yet that just when it had become real would be when someone from the outside would try to convince them, and convince the world, that it was nothing more than a well-rehearsed performance. Nor did they know that the threat would not come from a stranger. It would come from someone who knew them both well enough to know exactly where to squeeze, and who, moved by an old resentment that neither of them had noticed accumulating, was about to use their story as a weapon. Autumn in the interior of São Paulo was too beautiful to be a warning, but it was. The article was published on a Tuesday morning, on the most read agribusiness business portal in Brazil. The title was of a calculated restraint that made the blow more efficient. Behind the scenes of the Monteiro-Cavalcante merger, marriage or contract with a ring. The text had 6 paragraphs, 3 anonymous sources, and a surgical precision regarding details that only someone on the inside could know. Isabella read the article on her cell phone while still in bed, at 6:20 in the morning before the alarm. Eduardo was in the bathroom. She kept reading and rereading the paragraphs with that analytical attention she applied to complex contracts, looking for the logic behind each choice of word. The article asserted nothing directly. It was smarter than that. It asked questions that suggested answers. It presented real facts, the proximity of the marriage to the signing of the merger agreement, the history of the families, the absence of any public relationship between the two before the engagement, and left the reader to construct the conclusion that the journalist obviously wanted them to construct. Facade union, agreement disguised as romance, estate marrying estate and using sentiment as wrapping. Eduardo came out of the bathroom in a towel and found her silence. "What is it?" She rotated the phone towards him. He read it standing up without sitting. He read the entire article with that expression she knew as the face from before, the closed executive, jaw at the wrong angle. When he finished, he was silent for a moment. "Someone who knows the merger numbers," he said. "This is not journalistic speculation. Someone passed information." "I know. I need to call my legal team." "Eduardo," he raised his eyes. "Is this true?" she asked. Her voice was stable, but there was something beneath the stability that he recognized immediately because he knew the same mechanism in himself, the armor closing as a precaution before the pain arrived. "The article or what it's suggesting?" "What it's suggesting." She set down the phone. "Because it's what it started as, and if someone is saying it's still that, I need to know if you agree." There was a naked vulnerability in that question that cut deeper than any direct accusation. Eduardo looked at her for a moment, and in that moment there was a real choice being made, the choice between the usual defense mechanism, which was to retreat into the language of facts and objectivity, and something harder and truer. "I don't agree," he said. "That is not what this is." "Then why does it seem like you're more worried about the legal team than about what I just asked?" The question hung in the air. Eduardo placed his phone on the dresser with a care that indicated he was controlling more than the speed of the gesture. "Because it's how I function when I'm afraid," he said. Finally, with an honesty that obviously cost something. Isabella was silent. Then she said, "Me too." But the damage had begun in a way neither of them had foreseen, not by the article itself, but by what the article woke up. Doubt doesn't need to be rational to be powerful, and the history of both had too much rational not to give fuel to it. Two intelligent adults raised to separate sentiment from strategy, placed together for convenience. How hard would it be for an external observer to believe that what had emerged between them was real? How hard would it be for themselves when the external mirror began to reflect the version others constructed? During the following days, the portal had its own developments. Other outlets followed suit. A business behavior columnist wrote a longer text about the practice of marriages as a merger strategy in agribusiness, using Isabella and Eduardo as a case study without either of them having been consulted. The families began to receive calls. Renato Montero called his daughter with a concern that was genuine, but also had that layer of image management she knew all too well. "This will pass," he said, "but we need to think about how you position yourselves publicly." "I am not going to position myself publicly about my marriage, Dad." Isabella. No. Helio Cavalcante was more direct with Eduardo. In a call that lasted 22 minutes and that Eduardo made from the office with the door closed, his father placed on the table what had been implied from the start. The merger needed narrative stability. If the marriage was perceived as fragile, investors would retreat. There was a meeting with international funds scheduled for January. That article had arrived at the most inconvenient moment possible. Eduardo returned home that night with the weight of a conversation he hadn't told Isabella yet. She was in the office when he arrived, and he went straight to the veranda with a glass of water and stayed there for a while, looking at the dark garden. She found him there half an hour later. "Your father called," she said. "Mine too. What did he say to you?" Eduardo took a deep breath. "That the marriage needs to be managed as an asset." Isabella was silent. There was a cruel irony in that. Just when the marriage had ceased to be an asset for her, someone on the outside was trying to reduce it back to that. "And did you agree?" "No, but you didn't disagree." He turned to her. "Isabella, you don't need to explain." She crossed her arms. "I know how it works. I know exactly how it works because I grew up inside it, and that's why I know that when the external narrative starts to pull, either you pull back or it swallows you." "What do you mean?" "That I'm afraid," she said, with a clarity that was the opposite of what the words suggested. "Not of the article, of what it's doing in here." She placed her hand on her chest with a dry gesture, almost irritated with herself. "Because I spent my whole life defending myself from being reduced to an estate, and now there's a part of me looking at what we have and asking if we built something real or if we adapted so well to the arrangement that we confused adaptation with sentiment." Eduardo looked at her for a long moment, and then he said something she didn't expect. "Do you remember the night of the association dinner?" "Yes." "When my father made that toast, 2 estates that became one." He paused. "I looked at you and thought it was the first time in my life I was with someone who understood the specific weight of those words, not in an abstract way, in a visceral way because you carried the same weight." He paused again. "You don't plan that, Isabella, and you don't confuse it." She was silent for a while. "You should have said that before." "You too." There was enough truth in that stalemate for both to remain silent for a moment, but there was also, beneath the truth, a crack that the article had opened, not between the two of them, but inside each one. And open cracks need to be treated so they don't widen even when the foundation is solid. They didn't know yet that the foundation was about to be tested in a way neither of them had anticipated. The source of the article had a name. It took Eduardo 3 days to find out, but when he did, he stood still in the middle of the office for a long moment, looking at the laptop screen, as if he needed time to reorganize a structure that had collapsed. Rodrigo Valladares, a minority partner in Cavalcante Agro, Eduardo's second cousin on his mother's side, who had entered the company with a small share inherited from his grandfather, and who, over the last 2 years, had built a silent and meticulous resentment against the direction Eduardo had given the business. Rodrigo had opposed the merger with the Monteros from the start, not out of principle, but because the operation diluted his share even further. When the other partners approved the move, he had voted against and left the meeting without saying anything. He had said nothing inside. He had said everything outside. Felipe was the one who brought the confirmation. A common contact who had recognized specific details that only Rodrigo could have passed on, information that was in an internal presentation to which only the partners had access. Eduardo heard everything sitting in the office chair with that closed expression Isabella knew well, but which now had a different quality. It wasn't the executive containing the storm. It was the man who had been betrayed by someone from his own family processing what that meant. He didn't tell Isabella immediately. That was the mistake. She noticed there was something he was holding back. She knew his pattern well enough now to recognize the difference between Eduardo's natural silence and the silence that covered something. For 2 days, he was distant in a way that wasn't hostile, but that created a distance that had been eliminated with such care in the previous weeks. He arrived late. He answered with short sentences. He stayed in the office after dinner for too long. On the 3rd night, she went to the office door and knocked. "Eduardo, I'm finishing an analysis. I'm not asking what you're doing. I'm saying you've been closing the door in my face for 3 days, and I want to know why." There was a silence on the other side. Then the sound of a chair moving. The door opened. He was tired in a way that wasn't physical. It was the tiredness of someone who carried something for too long without sharing. "It was Rodrigo," he said. She stood motionless for a second. "Rodrigo Valladares?" "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was still trying to understand, or because you are still treating me as a separate part of the things that matter to you." The sentence came out with a precision that hurt, and Isabella knew it had hurt the second she said it, but she didn't take it back, because it was true and because she had learned that truths not taken back ferment. Eduardo was silent for a moment. "It's not that." "Then what is it?" "It's that Rodrigo is family. And even if what he did is wrong, there's a part of me that still doesn't know how to process that without resolving it internally first." He paused. "It's not about you not deserving to know. It's about me not knowing how to take this to another person without having understood it yet." Isabella looked at him. It was an honest answer. It was also an answer that revealed a limit she needed to learn to recognize without interpreting as rejection. "But I am not another person," she said with more softness than she had used before. "I am the person who is here." He nodded, slowly, with the weight of someone who was learning something no one had taught him. "I know. I'm sorry." He told everything then. Rodrigo, the internal presentation, the vote against the merger, the resentment built over months. Isabella listened, sitting in the chair facing his desk without interrupting, with that attention he had learned to recognize as the most complete form of presence she offered. When he finished, she was silent for a moment. "He will try again," she said. "Not with the press this time. Rodrigo understands that the article didn't have the effect he wanted. He will look for another way." "Which one?" "Inside the company. Some corporate issue, some interpretation of a clause that weakens the position of you two before the January meeting." She crossed her legs with the posture of someone thinking out loud. "Send me the corporate documents tomorrow morning." "Isabella, you don't need to—" "Eduardo." She looked at him with a firmness that wasn't aggressive, but that didn't accept objection. "You are my husband. The company this man is trying to weaken is linked to my family's name too, and I am a corporate lawyer. Send me the documents." He looked at her for a second, and then, for the first time in 3 days, his face opened. "All right." The documents arrived before 7 in the morning. Isabella spent the entire day in her office in Ribeirão Preto with a reduced team, analyzing the social bylaws of Cavalcante Agro and the shareholder agreements with that attention that was almost surgical. What she found was better and worse than she expected. Better because Eduardo's position was more solid than Rodrigo apparently supposed. Worse because there was a specific clause about calling an extraordinary assembly that, if used creatively, could create enough legal noise to delay the January meeting. She called Eduardo at 5 in the afternoon with the summary. He's going to try to use Article 23 of the shareholders' agreement. It provides for an extraordinary assembly if 1/3 of the partners request it. Rodrigo doesn't have 1/3 alone, but if he convinces 2 more minor partners— "The Alcantara brothers," Eduardo said immediately. "They are his historical allies." "Exactly. If the 3 request it, you'll be stuck in litigation before the January meeting." "How do we block it?" "By anticipating." She already had the path mapped out. You voluntarily call a meeting for accountability before they request the extraordinary one. You remove their argument before it is even made. And in the same act, you formally present the update of the merger agreement with the adjustments I identify this week. There was a silence on the phone. Then, "You saw all that today?" It's what I do. Isabella. His voice had a different quality. Thank you. She was silent for a moment, sitting in the office chair with the window showing the end of the afternoon over the city. Don't thank me. You take care of your part and I'll take care of mine. But when she hung up, she stayed with the phone in her hand for an instant, feeling the exact weight of what she had just done. She hadn't done it because the Monteros had an interest in the merger. She hadn't done it out of a spouse's obligation or strategic calculation. She had done it because Eduardo was being attacked by someone he trusted, and she couldn't sit by watching it without acting. She stayed with that thought for a moment, and then recognized it for what it was. It wasn't duty. It was choice. It was the difference she had been trying to identify for weeks, the line between what had started as a contract and what had become something else entirely. And then the phone rang again. It was Mariana. Isabella answered, expecting her sister's voice. But what she heard in the first few seconds of the call changed the course of everything, because Mariana was crying, which was rare enough to be a sign, and the words that came from her after the crying were the ones Isabella least expected to hear at that moment. Mariana had found something. It wasn't the cry of someone in crisis. It was the cry of someone who had discovered a truth that changed the shape of things she believed she knew. Isabella left the office in 10 minutes and went to her sister's house, who lived in an apartment in Jardins 15 minutes away by car. She found Mariana sitting on the living room floor with papers scattered around, hair loose, eyes red from having cried some time ago, but having stopped. She was now in that phase after crying that is almost heavier than the crying itself. Marie! Isabella entered, closed the door and went to crouch in front of her sister. What happened? I was helping Mother organize the documents from Grandpa's office. Mariana picked up a thick envelope from the floor. I found this. The envelope had the handwriting of Isabella's maternal grandfather, Geraldo Montero, who had passed 16 years ago, but whose presence was still felt in the structure of the family business, like a foundation no one saw but everyone stepped on. Isabella opened the envelope with care and found letters. Old letters, handwritten, on letterhead she recognized immediately. It was the Cavalcante Agro paper from the 90s. The letters were from Helio Cavalcante to her grandfather. They dated back almost 30 years, and what they said, with the direct frankness of two businessmen who never supposed that correspondence would be read by anyone else, revealed a story that neither of the two had told their children. Isabella read everything 3 times, standing in the middle of her sister's living room, while Mariana stayed quiet, observing her sister's expression change as the pages turned. The story was this. 30 years ago, when Cavalcante Agro was still a small company and the Montero Fazenda was going through a severe crisis, because of a lost harvest, Helio Cavalcante had helped Geraldo Montero save the property. Not with money, with access. Helio had contacts with cooperatives and distributors that Geraldo didn't have, and he used those contacts to ensure the Monteros could sell what was left of the harvest with enough margin not to lose the lands. Geraldo had written in one of the letters, with an emotion that was not his usual style of writing, that he owed Helio more than he could pay in a lifetime. The last letter was from Helio, short. It said there was no debt between them, there was an alliance, and that one day, when the children were grown, the families would unite in a way that honored what had been built. Isabella stayed with the last letter in her hand for a long time. The children were grown, the families would unite. Her marriage to Eduardo had not been a cold business deal between two men thinking about estate. It had been the fulfillment of a promise of gratitude that was 30 years old. Renato Montero and Helio Cavalcante had not sold their children. They had honored a debt that the pride of both had never managed to settle in any other way. This didn't make their decision right. Isabella knew that. She had enough clarity to separate the motivation from the consequence, and the consequence had been placing her in a marriage without real consent. But it transformed the story. It gave it a dimension she hadn't seen, and that changed the way she looked at her father-in-law, and at the marriage that had, despite everything, become real. She called Eduardo from the sidewalk in front of Mariana's building. It was almost 8 at night. I need you to come to Mariana's apartment. Now? Now. He arrived in 20 minutes. Isabella was waiting for him on the sidewalk, with the letters in her hand and an expression he couldn't completely read. There was sadness and anger in it, and something more complex that neither of them would have an easy word to name. She handed him the letters without saying anything. He read them right there, standing on the sidewalk under the lamppost light. He read everything without stopping, turning the pages with that attention he reserved for important documents. When he finished, he was silent for a while. "Did you know?" she asked. "No." "Are you sure?" "Isabella." He raised his eyes. "No." She looked at him. She knew his face well enough to know when he was lying. The angle of the shoulders, the way he breathed. There was none of that. "I believe you," she said. And then she rested her forehead on his shoulder. It wasn't a calculated gesture. It was that of someone tired of keeping herself upright alone for too long. He placed an arm around her with that caution of someone who is still learning. They stayed like that on the silent sidewalk. "What do we do with this?" she asked. "We talk to them." "Both together?" "Both together," he confirmed, "because this conversation needs to be ours, not theirs. That ours was new. Not in the marriage. Ours had appeared in documents and professional contexts from the beginning, but that ours, there on the sidewalk, with the letters in hand and her head on his shoulder, had a different quality. It was the ours of two adults who had decided, without any contractual clause requiring it, to be on the same side. The meeting with the parents took place the following Sunday at Fazenda Santa Cruz, where everything had begun. Renato and Helio were sitting at the large table in the dining room when Isabella and Eduardo arrived, side by side, with that posture of those who shared the weight of something before arriving. Isabella put the letters on the table without ceremony. The silence that followed was long enough for everyone to feel what was being revealed. For the parents, the weight of what had been hidden for 3 decades. It was Helio who spoke first, with a voice older than usual. Geraldo asked not to tell. He said the children couldn't carry a debt that wasn't theirs. "But they carried it in another way," said Isabella. Her voice was firm, without anger. "They carried the marriage." "Isabella," Renato began. "Dad." She stopped him with gentleness, but clarity. "I'm not here to collect. I'm here because you deserve to know that we know, and because what you did, even if in the wrong way, came from a place I respect." Renato looked at his daughter with an expression that rarely appeared in him, a real exposure, without the layer of management he placed over everything. "I wanted to protect you," he said. "I always did." "I know, Dad." Eduardo looked at his own father, who had his eyes on the tabletop. Helio was a man of control, and there was something in that posture of someone who carried the consequences of a decision made with good intention, but without the consent of those who mattered most. "I should have told you," Helio said to his son. "Yes, you should have." The past was there, in the letters on the table, complete and irremediable. What there was to build lay ahead. On the way back to Ribeirão Preto, they traveled much of the way in silence. It was a pitch-black night, and the road cut through the dark interior with the headlights. Isabella looked out the window for a while. "Are you okay?" Eduardo asked. "I'm thinking about how the whole story could have destroyed us. It could have confirmed everything the article said, that we were a disguised agreement, that there was nothing real." She turned her face to him. "And it's not what happened. It wasn't. Why do you think?" "Why do you?" He considered the question with that seriousness he put into everything that deserved it, because we both decided at some point to stop defending ourselves from each other. She looked at him for an instant. Then she turned back to the window with a quieter expression, more settled. "When we get home," she said, "I want to have a tea and tell you what Mariana said before you arrived." "Is there more?" "There's always more," she replied, with a smile that he recognized in the dark reflection of the window. And the car continued down the interior road, carrying 2 adults who had entered a story as pieces of an agreement and who were leaving it as something that no contract in the world would have the capacity to describe. January arrived with the first summer rains of the interior, and with the meeting that had hovered over the last 2 months like a date on the calendar that organized everything around it. The conference room of Cavalcante Agro in Ribeirão Preto had been prepared with that precision Eduardo applied to important events. Projector, documents printed in triplicate, ice water in the glasses, nothing out of place. The international funds were represented by 4 executives who had come from São Paulo early in the morning. The partners of Cavalcante Agro occupied one side of the table. On the other, Isabella positioned herself beside Eduardo, not as a spouse, but as the lawyer for the merger with the correct blazer and the folder of documents she had prepared over 3 weeks of intense work. Rodrigo Valadares was present too, because he had a corporate share, and there was no way to exclude him from the meeting. But he arrived in silence and sat at the end of the table with the expression of someone who realized the ground he had tried to destabilize was more solid than he supposed. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Isabella led the legal part with a fluency that came from someone who had spent weeks inside every detail of those contracts. When the fund representatives asked questions about the risk points, she answered them before any external lawyer needed to intervene. When one of the executives raised the question about the stability of the corporate structure, a veiled reference to the article published months earlier, she opened the folder, placed the pertinent documents on the table and explained, with the patience of someone who doesn't need to defend herself because the facts already speak, that all speculation had been legally addressed and that the merger was following its course with its original solidity. Eduardo observed her during that answer and felt something he hadn't felt in a meeting room in his entire life. The genuine impulse to tell everyone that that woman was his wife, not out of the pride of possession that the families would celebrate, but out of the simple and real pride of someone who recognizes competence and character when he sees them. He said nothing. But when the meeting ended and the executives gave the green light for the continuity of the process, Eduardo waited for everyone to leave and then stood beside Isabella while she organized the papers in the folder. "You were extraordinary," she raised her eyes. "It was what I do." "I know." He paused. "But thank you anyway." She closed the folder, tilted her head slightly to the side, with that expression he had learned was her way of receiving something without knowing exactly where to put it. "You're welcome," she said, and then with a small smile, "Next time you could give more notice that the meeting starts at 8. I gave notice at 8:05. At 8:03, I timed it." He laughed. It was a full laugh, without the usual restraint, and she stayed looking at him for a second with the expression of someone who still gets surprised from time to time by how much a person can change when they stop trying to be what they never were. Rodrigo resigned from his corporate share 2 weeks later, through a lawyer without direct contact. Eduardo accepted the terms with the precision of someone closing a chapter and not looking back. Isabella conducted the exit documents with the usual efficiency, and when she signed the last paper, she simply filed the folder and went to make coffee. Fazenda Santa Cruz received the two on a February weekend, not out of family obligation, but by their own choice. Renato was quieter than usual. There was a new humility in him that the marriage had produced collaterally, the recognition that loving well sometimes means admitting the form was wrong, even when the intention was good. Helio was different too, not the patriarch who managed the family as he managed the company, but an older man sitting on the veranda watching the sunset with a cup of coffee, capable of being in silence without filling the silence with strategy. It was on one of those afternoons, with the 4 sitting on the veranda of the fazenda and the sun descending over the fields that stretched as far as the eye could see, that Renato said something Isabella didn't expect. "Geraldo would have liked you, Eduardo." Eduardo was silent for a moment. "From what I read in the letters, I would have liked him too." Renato nodded, with that slow movement of the head of someone who recognizes the justice of a thing that cannot be undone, but can be honored. Isabella took Eduardo's hand without thinking. It was an automatic gesture, the kind that happens when the body has already incorporated the other's presence as part of the natural landscape of life. He turned his hand slightly to meet hers, and they stayed like that for a moment, looking at the fields, needing nothing more than that. The ring that Isabella had looked at with such ambivalence on the day of the wedding was there, shining slightly in the late afternoon, and for the first time she didn't think about the contract that had produced that ring. She thought about the breakfast made without being asked, about the documents studied deep into the night, on the sidewalk under the lamppost with the letters in hands, about the laughs that came from places neither of them had planned to reach. No agreement would have been capable of producing that. No interest, no strategy, no corporate merger. That had been built brick by brick, choice by choice, by the repeated and silent decision of two adults who learned, against all logic of their own stories, that the hardest part is not to love. It is to allow oneself to be loved without defending oneself. And there, on the veranda of Fazenda Santa Cruz, with the sun setting over the interior of São Paulo and the smell of moist earth rising from the fields, was the answer to a question neither of them had asked out loud at the altar. Yes, it was worth it. Not the agreement. The choice. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Isabella and Eduardo touched your hearts as much as it touched ours while creating it. Two adults who entered a room as estates and left it as people. This is a story that the interior of São Paulo knows well, but that someone rarely tells until the end. If you've made it this far, it's because you know that the best stories are not the ones that end as we expect, but the ones that end as we need. We have prepared a special list with equally captivating narratives about love, choice, and starting over. Find it here to the side. If this story moved something in you, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments. Did you believe in their love from the beginning, or did you need to be convinced? Every day we bring stories that explore what is most human in life. Don't miss the next chapters of our collection. We'll wait for you there.